Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Snob, and welcome to Tier Ranking Every Roman Emperor Part 2. In Part 1 of this series, we covered the emperors from Augustus to Domitian, and in this video, we're going to be examining the lives and careers of the emperors from Nerva up to Caracalla. We will be beginning with the reign of the so-called 5 good emperors, but if you are here for the bad emperors, don't worry, because there's going to be plenty of those as well. Just quickly, if you haven't already, if you appreciate this content, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. It helps out a great deal. Now, without further ado, let's pick up where we left off with the death of Domitian and the accession of the Emperor Nerva. So Nerva was emperor from AD 96 to AD 98, and he was proclaimed by the Senate as emperor the same day that Domitian was murdered. Nerva was, by Roman standards, pretty old by the time he became emperor. He was 66 years old, but his health was also poor. So he wasn't like ancient, but he was a sickly man, and it was probably clear to all that he would not live for very long. Apart from being elderly, Nerva was an odd choice because he just didn't, he had a very obscure and strange career prior to becoming emperor. So Nerva had first kind of come to imperial prominence under the reign of Nero. He was good friends with Nero. Otho was his brother-in-law. He served as a consul under Vespasian and under Domitian as well. He was sort of like a professional courtier. He was someone who was close friends with successive emperors, despite the fact that many of these emperors did not like each other and killed each other. It seems like they all liked Nerva, which suggests he has some kind of political skill. What exactly that is sort of lost to us because his career is a little bit murky before he becomes emperor, but it's clear that he's a weird choice because he wasn't really a military man. He'd never been like a provincial governor. He was not widely known necessarily to the public, and he was also elderly and childless. The way he's sort of like close to a whole bunch of different emperors is, I don't know, it's sort of like a Henry Kissinger thing where like everybody likes this guy for some reason. And he's in with everyone. And in a way, him becoming emperor is kind of like I don't know, like if Littlefinger actually ended up becoming king of the Seven Kingdoms. Like, really? This guy, this kind of like shady, shadowy guy who's just perpetually a member of the cabinet, always sort of around, but not really at the center of power. At any rate, as mentioned, Nerva was proclaimed by the Senate. And it happened very fast after Domitian died, which suggests that there was some kind of broader plot to murder Domitian, that the Senate was at least aware of it. Nerva may have been as well. On the other hand, they may have just quickly chosen Nerva as a placeholder to prevent a civil war. Unclear. Interestingly, Nerva is the first time the Senate just flat out directly chooses an emperor. In the past, what the Senate did was it ratified the wills of previous emperors. It had been forced to accept the winners of civil wars or sort of browbeaten into accepting emperors. But this is the first time where the Senate just sort of goes into conclave and chooses a guy, and the guy they chose was Nerva. So despite the fact that he was friends with some pretty icky emperors, Nerva himself was kindly and moderate, and he proved this when he was in power. He ended the persecution of senators. He provided amnesty for a lot of senators who had been, convicted or imprisoned or exiled during the reign of Domitian, and he returned a lot of their property that had been seized by Domitian. So, as noted in the previous episode, by this time it had become pretty much standard that everyone gets a big payout when there's a new emperor called a donative, and Nerva gave generous donatives, particularly to the Praetorian Guard. He certainly had to do this because he had not been chosen by the Praetorian Guards, unlike certain previous emperors, and he had no real legitimacy other than the fact that he had just been chosen by the Senate. Nerva was kind to the common people. He gave away large amounts of land to people who were destitute. He issued loans to the rich and then used the interest to give alms to orphans and poor children in Italy. This welfare system was called the alimenta, and it would continue for about 180 years. It would also be expanded by Nerva's successors, but this seems to have originated with him. Nerva also reduced the fiscus judicus, a special tax that only Jews within the empire had to pay. So to help pay for all of this stuff, Nerva melted down gold and silver statues that Domitian had built of himself, and he also auctioned off a lot of Domitian's property and estates. In general, he was frugal. He abolished various games and races that were expensive and were seen as sort of trivial or unnecessary. And he also created a special commission to reduce the cost of government, basically. However, Nerva's reign was pretty tenuous from the beginning because, as mentioned, he was elderly. He was not in good health. he had no heir, and because there were also a good number of supporters of Domitian who were still around, particularly in the army, but there were some in the Senate as well. So despite the fact that one of the people involved in the conspiracy to kill Domitian had been the Praetorian prefect, the rest of the Praetorian guards liked him, and they wanted the people who assassinated Domitian to be executed. Nerva refused to do this. And this was sort of the key issue of Nerva's reign, was conflict with the Praetorian guards and with the army. So in October of AD 97, the Praetorian guard actually took Nerva hostage in his own palace, and they forced him to agree to a list of demands. To wit, he agreed to execute Domitian's assassins. He adopted as his heir the popular general Trajan, and then they made him give this super humiliating speech thanking them for basically kidnapping him and twisting his arm. So that was pretty much the end of Nerva's reign. He died in January of AD 98, a couple months after the whole incident with being kidnapped by the Praetorians. It seems that he had a stroke and died naturally. I will give Nerva a C. So Nerva clearly had political skill to a great degree, or he never would have died in bed. But the reality is he was too old, too sick, had no support. He was too much of a dark horse candidate. And his reign, even if he had been healthy, probably wouldn't have lasted much longer. I mean, he was effectively, when your own bodyguards take you hostage and force you to do things you don't want to do, that means you're really no longer emperor. You're not emperor if any guy with a sword can just kidnap you and make you do whatever. Nerva's most important decision was the adoption of Trajan, but that wasn't really his decision. But he did generally pursue good policies as long as he was alive and in power. And his decisions, like, for example, creating the Alimenta, set the stage for the following good emperors. So we'll give Nerva some credit for that. Essentially, I think Nerva's a good version of Galba. Just this old guy who's a safe pair of hands, choose a worthy successor, and then quietly die. Okay, let's move on to Trajan, who is one of the most famous and celebrated of Roman emperors. Trajan reigned from AD 98 to 117. So Trajan was a successful general. He, during the reign of Domitian, had helped to put down a revolt by a guy named Saturninus, and he had sort of worked his way up through the army. He was later made governor of, I think, Pannonia, one of the provinces on the Rhine that's quite important. Domitian made him a governor, and he performed well in that role as well, so well that he was given the name Germanicus to sort of celebrate his achievements, which is a big deal. As we mentioned, Trajan was chosen, air quotes, chosen by Nerva, but really there was kind of no choice. Trajan was kind of the only person on the scene who was a serious candidate who ticked every box, had support from the army, had significant experience, came from the right kind of family, etc. So basically Nerva chose Trajan because if there'd been a civil war, Trajan would have won it. It is sometimes erroneously claimed that Trajan was Spanish. This is not true. His family, he was born in Spain. In fact, he was the first Roman emperor who was born outside of Italy, but his family was not ethnically Spanish or related to any of the people who were living in Spain at that time. They were Italians who had been living in Spain, and he came from a senatorial family. So he's not a started from the bottom guy, and he is ethnically and culturally Roman. Trajan is most famous as a conqueror. As we noted in the last episode, Domitian had tried to wage war against King Decebalus of Dacia, which is modern-day Romania, because the Dacians had been raiding Roman territory and sort of menacing the Danube frontier out there. However, Domitian failed to defeat Decebalus and had to sue for peace, and even essentially paid him protection money to not make war on Rome. Trajan was not going to take that lying down and was determined to avenge this humiliation against Roman arms. So in AD 101 to 102, Trajan led a large army into Dacia. This became the First Dacian War. What really marks Trajan's campaign out as different is that he put a lot of effort into logistics. So in order to make it easier to invade Dacia, which is across the Danube from Roman territory, Trajan built what was at the time the largest arch bridge in the world across the Danube so that he could lead his legions across the river. Sometimes the Danube would freeze in wintertime, but obviously it's pretty precarious leading thousands of men across a frozen river where the ice might not be very thick. Building a huge bridge made it easier for Trajan to move his troops into Dacia and also to supply himself while he was there. So he was, like many great commanders, he actually paid attention to logistics and not just strategy and tactics. He also built a bunch of roads to support this campaign. So the First Dacian War was a huge victory for Rome. and Trajan forced Decebalus to accept severe peace terms, which included the Dacians agreeing to dismantle their physical fortifications. They had to surrender a bunch of weapons, and they had to agree that the Romans were allowed to keep a garrison on the Dacian side of the Danube River. Decebalus stuck to these terms for a short period of time, but then he began violating them again. He began rebuilding his force. He was not done, and he started harrying the Romans again after a few years. So in AD 105, Trajan launched the Second Dacian War, and at this time, the objective was to permanently eliminate the Dacians as a threat, seize their territory, and annex it. So Trajan and his legions laid siege to the Dacian capital of Sarmizegetusa Regia. There's a mouthful. They employed siege engines, but also critically, Trajan had his troops destroy the pipes that brought fresh water into the city. And they built a circumvallation wall, which is a sort of siege wall that you build around the wall of the city. So they totally surrounded the city. They forced it to capitulate. Decebalus tried to flee, but ended up taking his own life. And Trajan, having won the war against the Dacians once and for all, succeeding where Domitian had failed, annexed Dacia as a province, and critically seized huge amounts of gold and silver from the Dacian treasury. The exact amount of how much gold and silver the Romans took is disputed, but something like 5 years worth of the entire Roman army's budget, a huge, huge amount of gold, which Trajan was able to use to fund all kinds of things. An enormous, enormous victory. One of the things Trajan spent the gold on was building the Column of Trajan in Rome, which depicts his victory over the Dacians and still stands today. It's quite impressive. You can see it if you visit the city. Trajan's other great conquest was against the Parthians in the east. So, by the way, the Parthians, we've mentioned them a couple times. They're not quite the same as the Persians. They're a different ethnic group, but they're effectively ruling what we would call Persia at this point. They are an Iranian people. And they were the sort of the threat to the Mediterranean Near East that was controlled by the Romans. So between AD 114 and 117, Trajan conquered Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Assyria from the Parthians. He succeeded in capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, although this was they basically sacked it and then retreated. It's not like they took it in with the intention of holding it. Still impressive. And these conquests in the east brought Rome to its greatest physical extent. This is the largest that the empire would ever be, is under the reign of Trajan, which really marks Trajan out as probably the greatest conqueror among the Roman emperors. So as mentioned, Trajan used the gold from his conquest, particularly of Dacia, to fund a huge building program. His most famous contribution was Trajan's Forum, which was the largest in the city of Rome. Sadly, most of it no longer exists, but it included 2 libraries, a gigantic courthouse. I think there was a temple there, and an enormous open-air market, which was kind of, some have described as the world's first open-air mall. He also built a lot of ports, aqueducts, roads, the things that most good emperors did, and he expanded and continued the Alimenta that was started by his adoptive father, Nerva. Even more impressive, I would argue, than Trajan's conquest is that he managed to maintain good relations with the Senate through all of this. So at the start of his reign, Trajan had executed the Praetorian guards who had kidnapped Nerva, but other than that, he really didn't execute a lot of people. He was kind of keen not to be seen as someone who arbitrarily used his power to just knife rivals. Trajan ended anonymous denunciations for treason. So random people anonymously just saying, oh, I don't like this guy, you should kill him. This obviously creates an atmosphere of paranoia among the elite that makes them very uncomfortable. And Trajan eliminated this. And perhaps that's why the senators liked them, because what's also interesting is that Trajan was popular with the Senate despite the fact that he curbed their power. Perhaps at this point, after the reign of Domitian, they were just happy with any emperor who would not, kill them. But one of the things that senators did still get to do, or the Senate still got to do, was there were certain provinces that were to be governed by senators. Trajan actually reduced the number of these and took more provinces into imperial control and away from the Senate. He also emphasized competence in his appointments rather than favoritism, but he was beloved by the Senate and had a unanimous reputation as a just ruler, and indeed the Senate gave him the title Optimus Princeps, or Best Prince. So Trajan got sick and died in AD 117 while he was on his way back from his campaign in Parthia. He was mourned by all and obviously was deified by the Senate. If there's one point of criticism of Trajan, it's that his conquests, particularly in Parthia, were probably too much, as we'll see. I don't want to get to that too much now because that bears on the reign of his successor Hadrian to a great extent. But these conquests were perhaps spreading the empire's resources too thin and were too much to handle. I mean, it's hard in the ancient world, particularly, to control what's going on in Iraq from the city of Rome. Nevertheless, a Trajan obviously is an A+. He may well have been the best emperor. The Senate may have been right in calling him Optimus Princeps. I would consider him to be even better than Augustus because Trajan had the political skill of Augustus, but he was also in his own right a great commander, something that Augustus was not. Basically, he epitomized what a Roman emperor was supposed to be. He was a great warrior. He was a great politician. He was someone who did not have to reign through fear because he was able to make people admire and respect him. And so he was able to rule like Augustus while also being a great conqueror. In terms of what a Roman emperor is, it's really hard to ask for better than Trajan. Okay, that brings us to Hadrian, who ruled from AD 117 to 138. So Hadrian was Trajan's second cousin. He became Trajan's ward at the age of 10 because his parents died. Hadrian also later married Trajan's grandniece in a political marriage, although their union was strictly political, pretty miserable, and ultimately they had no children. So Hadrian campaigned with Trajan for a while, and he was made a governor by Trajan. But in the last 10 years or so of Trajan's reign, it seems like Hadrian was kind of sidelined. It seems as though the two had some kind of falling out. There was some kind of rift between them. It seems like more than Trajan was Hadrian's advocate. It was actually Trajan's wife, Pertinax, who really took up Hadrian's cause. Trajan never really adopted Hadrian, interestingly, even though he could have done so on his deathbed. The document that was produced, proving that Trajan had adopted Hadrian was actually signed by Trajan's wife, Pertinax. So Hadrian's succession is not as clean-cut as it would later be portrayed. It seems like he had a somewhat difficult relationship with Trajan. It's hard to say why, but maybe there's some hints as to what they might have disagreed about in the way that Hadrian reigned. Regardless, Hadrian was declared emperor by Trajan's troops, and he was accepted. His adoption was accepted despite the fact that it was legally kind of dubious. But the insecurity of Hadrian's early reign is indicated by the fact that shortly after taking power, he completely illegally executed 4 senators, probably because he felt like they were a threat to him or that they weren't in his corner. And this permanently soured Hadrian's relationship with the Senate. The Senate would never be big fans of Hadrian after this because of his sort of extrajudicial execution of 4 of their number, something that a sequence of events that would not have taken place under the reign of Trajan. However, the Senate also had ample reason to dislike Hadrian because Hadrian had a totally different vision of how to rule the empire than Trajan did. So as mentioned, Trajan's conquest of Mesopotamia was too much. It strained the resources of the empire. The territories were too far away to manage, and it was causing problems in Rome's other eastern provinces. So Hadrian abandoned Trajan's conquests in the east. He restored Armenia and several of the other sort of buffer kingdoms between the Romans and the Parthians. Armenia was set up as a Roman puppet state, where it was a nominally independent country, but Rome got to control who the king was. These buffer kingdoms and the question of how to delineate Roman versus Parthian influence in the east would be a problem for a long time. I mean, Armenia would continue to be a problem into the Byzantine period. Having these buffer states between Persia and between the Romans meant that both sides were either fighting each other over direct control of these territories or fighting over who got to pick who the king of Armenia was, because Armenia is sort of stuck in between these two great powers. Hadrian was not interested in conquest. He thoroughly rejected the sort of more expansionist vision of Trajan, who probably would have liked to conquer even more if he had lived. Hadrian instead saw that the empire had reached its maximum potential extent, and the thing to do was actually to pull back and consolidate the territory that the empire already controlled and strengthen its borders to make sure that it was secure. Hadrian understood that if the Roman Empire continued expanding outward, ultimately it would become vulnerable because its troops and its ability to control events would be just spread too thin. The most famous example of this is Hadrian's Wall, which is in the north of England. Hadrian's Wall is not a particularly impressive structure, and it doesn't make a big sort of impact on the landscape. It's not like the Great Wall of China or something. It's more like a sort of small little wall or mound that is meant to delay invasion. The theory here is defense in depth. Hadrian's idea was to build a sort of network of walls, of forts, of watchtowers, of army camps, of obstacles that would make it difficult for raiders or invaders to penetrate the Roman frontier without raising the alarm. Hadrian was also a great traveler, so he spent half of his reign outside of Italy. He liked to tour the provinces, and he was doing this border security intensification through personal inspection and through actually visiting these places and making decisions about what should be built where, etc. I'm not sure if he visited every province in the empire, but he visited at least almost all of them. He was constantly on the move, and this gave him a great deal of firsthand information about what was actually going on, but it also kind of made him a little bit of a micromanager. And of course, when the emperor is traveling around, it is a bit of a strain on the provinces because, emperors don't come alone and they don't travel light. They show up with a huge entourage and everybody has to be fed and housed. And of course, from the view of provincial officials and governors, nobody likes working with their boss standing directly behind their back all day. As noted, Hadrian was all about consolidation, and he was all about building. He set about a building program to rival his kind of adoptive father, Trajan. He was also about promoting culture, particularly Greek culture. Hadrian considered himself to be culturally Greek. He was a Hellenist, and this is why Hadrian is the first Roman emperor to be depicted as bearded. Previously, all emperors were always depicted as clean-shaven. We're not here for a history of facial hair, but the beard was more than just a sort of sartorial choice on Hadrian's part. It was meant to connect him to the bearded Greek philosophers, to indicate that he saw himself as being culturally Greek, and he saw Roman culture as being an expansion of Greek culture, a sort of pan-Hellenism. This was a somewhat controversial cultural view in Roman society. There were those who did not really like Greek culture, and the Greeks were kind of uppity because they were part of the Roman Empire, but they saw Roman culture, indeed, the Roman pantheon of traditional gods being, totally based on Greek culture. So Hadrian was fascinated by Greece. He loved to spend time in Greece. He participated in a number of religious cults that were based in Greece and observed the miracles and went through the sacred rites there as well. He was like an Aristotle fanboy. Hadrian was also a civil service reformer. He tried to standardize the bureaucracy, administration, and law across the provinces, probably also a result of his travels and not wanting to see things done different ways in different places. He also began issuing what were called rescripts, which were sort of like legal executive orders. This is a centralizing tendency that becomes a trend, trying to sort of standardize things across the empire, taking the power to make individual decisions away from local governors or client kings, and trying to make the entire empire sort of more governed in a more regular way and not having a bunch of slapdash ad hoc rules all over the place, and having the emperor be the person who is determining what the rules are, what the standards are everywhere. This is more biographical, but it is interesting. Hadrian was almost certainly what we would call gay. The Romans did not conceive of sexual orientation the way that we did. There were sexual acts, but it wasn't, that one's choice of sexual acts was not necessarily part of one's identity as long as they were not what the Romans considered to be aberrant. Roman society was generally tolerant of homosexuality, but within certain bounds. So for a free man or a man of the elite, a man of society such as Hadrian, to engage in sex with men was totally normal, acceptable, did not confer any stain on his reputation. Basically, and this is an oversimplification, but Romans were okay with being gay as long as you're a top, to put it as bluntly as possible. So Hadrian's sexual orientation was not considered to be a problem, although what was considered to be a problem was that he sort of became obsessed with one particular lover, a young man named Antoninus, who he met while he was in Greece. Antoninus was a youth at the time. It seems that Hadrian sent him to Rome to be educated and then gradually sort of fell in love with him. He was much younger than Hadrian. Hadrian took Antoninus on tour with him, and was completely devastated when Antoninus died in Egypt. He seems to have fallen off a boat and drowned in the Nile River. But Hadrian we would call Hadrian gay. The Romans didn't have a word for gay, but it seems like there's no indication that he had any interest in women at all. His marriage, as we had mentioned, was purely political and unhappy, and also was childless. Yeah, a little glimpse into how sexuality was seen in the Roman world. The darkest chapter of Hadrian's reign was the Third Roman-Jewish War, which took place between AD 132 and 136. So the exact reasons why this another uprising in Judea took place, it's a little bit sketchy and it is debated. It seems to have been a rejection of what was seen as perhaps high-handed Roman rule, or, sometimes depicted as Hadrian's attempts to make the entire Roman world more homogeneous and more culturally Greek. But whatever its causes, the revolt was devastating. Having a revolt that takes 4 years to put down, that's a long time. It resulted supposedly in just huge casualties on both sides. I saw one estimate that maybe 500,000 people died, which is just enormous. After this, the province was reorganized. Many of the Jewish inhabitants were enslaved, and Hadrian was very bitter about this. He saw this as a rejection of his sort of standardization and Greekifying of the Roman Empire. It was an extremely bitter and bloody affair. So Hadrian seems to have had chronic health issues in his final years. It's possible he had heart disease or something like that. He died in AD 138. Shortly before he died, he adopted Antoninus Pius on the condition that Pius would swear to adopt Marcus Aurelius and a guy called Lucius Verus. So Hadrian chose not only his own successor, but also his successors' successors. At any rate, I will give Hadrian a B+. Hadrian is a clear step down from Trajan, mainly because he lacked Trajan's political tact. He was kind of temperamental, and he had a little bit of a cruel streak. He was seen by people at the time as being both intrusive in that he liked to travel around and see and to check up on what his officials were doing, but also kind of aloof and a little bit removed because he was not, he was always on the move. However, Hadrian was a great reformer, and he was, I think, extremely wise to recognize that further conquests would avail Rome nothing, and the wiser course of action was to consolidate power and to make sure that the territories Rome did control were governed in a more standardized way, were more defensible, and would be less susceptible to outside invasion. Okay, that brings us to Hadrian's handpicked successor, Antoninus Pius, who ruled from AD 138 to 161. Antoninus Pius is maybe the weirdest emperor we're going to have to rank because despite the fact that he ruled for 23 years, the truth is that almost nothing happened during his reign. There's really very little to talk about. There were some minor disturbances in the provinces, but they were all dealt with pretty easily. He's like the exact opposite of Hadrian in many ways because in his entire 2 decades as emperor, he never left Italy, and it's famously said that he never came within 500 miles of a legion. One thing that Antoninus Pius did do early in his reign is he built or authorized the construction of the Antonine Wall in Scotland, which is further north than Hadrian's Wall. So the Romans were kind of pushing a little bit further north into what is now Scotland. But other than that, he basically spent his entire reign as a Platonic philosopher king. Antoninus was given the name Pius because he persuaded the Senate to deify Hadrian, even though they didn't want to because they had not liked Hadrian very much. He also pardoned some senators whom Hadrian had supposedly sentenced to death in his sort of gloomy twilight years. So Antoninus Pius had a better relationship with the Senate. He was seen as a sort of traditional conservative aristocratic guy. One cool thing Antoninus Pius did is he strengthened the legal rights of slaves against mistreatment. So I believe he made it so that if someone habitually mistreated their slaves, the state could force them to be sold to a better master. He also supposedly introduced the idea of presumption of innocence into Roman legal practice. The idea that, hey, we should not treat you as though you've been convicted before you've been convicted. This seems like a pretty basic idea to us living today, but that was not always the case in Roman law. Antoninus Pius was big on due process and presumption of innocence. About the only other interesting thing to say about Antoninus Pius is that he may have sent an embassy to China, since the Chinese record some years later receiving an embassy from Dekin, which was their word for Rome. But if he did send this embassy, they arrived after his death, And they may have also just been merchants passing themselves off as ambassadors, a la Marco Polo. So unclear, but, there's not a lot to say about Antoninus Pius. So I'm grasping at straws here. The bottom line is Antoninus Pius ruled over, probably the most peaceful period in Roman history. He died in 161 of natural causes. I would give Antoninus Pius a B+. Obviously, Antoninus Pius ruled well. He seems to have been beloved by everyone, respected by all as just, decent, as I said, a philosopher king. But the thing is, he faced no challenges, so I can't give him an A. He's a really good emperor, but he's not great. I think in order to be great, you have to live in times that require greatness. It's sort of like, in order to win an Academy Award, you have to have the kind of role that will get you an Academy Award. In a way, I think he was kind of playing the game of emperor on easy mode. Not his fault, but, there's just nothing happened. Some political figures are fortunate enough to preside over eras of peace and prosperity, and the credit accrues to them for that, even if they didn't really especially do anything to bring it about. And I think that's the case with Antoninus Pius. Okay, that brings us to Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. As he promised to Hadrian, Antoninus Pius did adopt both of these young men and made them his heirs. Let's address Verus quickly. Verus ruled jointly with Marcus Aurelius from AD 161 to 169. This is the first time that there were two co-emperors ruling at the same time. This would obviously become more common and standard practice later on, not just when the empire divided into East and West, but also the practice of having a co-emperor or having a senior emperor and a junior emperor, an Augustus and a Caesar, as the term would come to be later on. But this is the first time you've got two emperors at the same time. However, Lucius Verus, although he was nominally of the same rank, they were both Augusti, both full emperors. Lucius Verus was very clearly the junior emperor to Marcus Aurelius. He pretty much did what Marcus Aurelius told him and was like his deputy. So we're not going to rank Lucius Verus independently because he was never really independently sole emperor, and it doesn't really make sense since he was like Marcus Aurelius's vice emperor, basically. We'll just examine Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius reigned from AD 161 to 180. Marcus is remembered not only as an emperor, but also as a Stoic philosopher. His meditations are still read today. I've read them personally. I don't find them that philosophically interesting. I think they're more interesting just as the sort of diary of an emperor who is also a sort of conscientious and thoughtful man. It's full of affirmations, him reminding himself that he has to be dutiful, he has to be fair, he has to be patient, etc., etc. Really, it's the diary of a man who is ruling over a very difficult time, and who is sort of trying to remind himself to stay level, stay balanced, etc., etc. So I would say that Marcus is kind of like a good Tiberius. Basically, Marcus Aurelius had imperial rule foisted upon him. He was not someone who wanted to be emperor, but he was chosen for this task, and he was someone who was absolutely determined to, stoically take it on the chin and do his duty, even though he would have been much happier just sort of being an aristocrat who spends his day reading philosophy. Even more than not wanting to be emperor, it seems that Marcus Aurelius really, really never wanted to be a general, but unfortunately, unlike his adoptive father, he was forced to fight a lot. And unlike the reign of Antoninus Pius, the reign of Marcus Aurelius was basically one protracted disaster. Not because he was a bad ruler, but because there were just all kinds of outside of events that forced him to constantly respond. He's sort of this figure of calm, stoic duty in the midst of a farrago of absolute chaos. So from 161 to 166, Lucius Verus, his junior emperor, led legions in a renewed war with Parthia. The Parthians, as I'd sort of alluded to, had been encroaching on the Roman puppet states that were meant to act as a buffer between Rome and Parthia. Ultimately, Verus did succeed in defeating the Parthians. It took a while. The Romans again sacked Ctesiphon. If you want to do a drinking game for this video, take a drink every time the Romans sack Ctesiphon. However, despite the victory that was achieved in Parthia, the legions were forced to withdraw because of an epidemic. A disease began to spread through the legions, and this came to be known as the Antonine Plague. Today, scholars think that it was probably either smallpox or measles, but whatever it was, the legions returned victorious from Parthia, but carrying a disease that would absolutely devastate the rest of the Roman world between AD 165 and 180. So this will be catastrophe for the empire for the rest of Marcus's reign. Ultimately, it's a little bit difficult to say just how deadly the Antonine Plague was, but it may have killed, say, 10% of the population of an empire at this time. Population was like maybe between 60 and 75 million. So this disease killed millions of people. Obviously, this devastated the army and also devastated the economy. Today we worry a little bit about overpopulation. In the pre-modern world, it was difficult when you consider war, disease, low life expectancy, the large number of children who die either in childbirth or in the first 10 years of life, the large mortality of women in giving birth. It was difficult just to sort of maintain the population, let alone to grow it. So having a plague like this spread through the entire empire made it more difficult to recruit soldiers to the army. It meant that there were fewer people working the fields. It led to all kinds of calamities that would color the rest of Marcus Aurelius's reign. So clearly there wasn't much that Marcus Aurelius could really do to stop this plague. He did, along with Verus, he performed religious rituals to try and appease the gods. Obviously, that did not help. Supposedly, the Romans attempted some kind of quarantines, trying to isolate sick people to stop the spread, but this did not work very well in the pre-modern world. Obviously, they had no idea what caused diseases like this and had no idea how to cure it. Marcus Aurelius opened up joining the legions to more people in order to make up the difference of the number of soldiers who were dying from disease. He made it possible for like slaves, gladiators, people who've been criminals, people from more sketchy backgrounds to join the legions. In order to attempt to repopulate areas of the empire that had been depopulated by the plague, he brought in foreigners, like people from outside the empire, immigrants basically, to work those lands to try to bring them back so that there would be more food, more economic activity to help the empire recover. In order to make up for the lost revenue that was caused by, all the mass death and the collapse of the economy, Marcus Aurelius auctioned off a lot of imperial property. Supposedly, he even auctioned off his wife's jewels. And he cracked down on wasteful spending and also corruption to try and make sure that the empire would remain solvent. He did shell out money, though. Marcus Aurelius made funds available to properly bury the poor who were, probably just piling up in the streets, and to provide appropriate funerals for them. So the Antonine Plague weakened the empire at the worst possible time because just as the plague was starting to set in, Rome was now facing external threats, particularly along the Rhine-Danube frontier, that would force Marcus Aurelius to spend most of his reign after 166 on campaign, the absolute last place that he wanted to be. So in AD 166, a coalition of barbarians consisting of the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians penetrated the Danube frontier and began raiding Roman territory. This will become a feature of imperial life, basically going forward. These barbarian groups north of the Rhine and Danube trying to sort of break into the Roman Empire. A lot of the reason why this is happening is probably because of the migrations, I should say, of other barbarian groups out of the sort of Russian steppe into Central and Western Europe, forcing the barbarian groups who lived on the Roman borders to try and seek shelter within the Roman Empire, try to find a way to find somewhere else to live where they were not going to be menaced by these other more exotic and often more terrifying barbarian groups that were from further east. So by AD 170, these invasions by the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians actually penetrated as far as Italy, which was kind of shocking to the Romans. Italy itself hadn't really been threatened for centuries. Apparently a bunch of Romans were taken captive, and these barbarians retreated back over the Rhine or over the Danube with Roman captives. So Marcus Aurelius took personal command of the legions and led a counterattack across the Danube. He defeated the Marcomanni and freed a bunch of Roman prisoners. Between AD 172 and 175, Marcus also defeated the Quadi and the Sarmatians. However, his campaign against this barbarian threat was interrupted by a guy called Avidius Cassius, who was the governor of Syria and a card-carrying idiot. Cassius had declared himself emperor in the mistaken belief that Marcus had died. Marcus Aurelius had to go to Syria to put down this revolt, but actually Cassius's own troops killed him before Marcus Aurelius could get there. So Marcus showed typical forbearance. He forgave everyone who was involved and had momentarily supported Cassius. He shook some hands, kissed some babies, and went back to the Danube to return to war in AD 177. So he was again forced to cross the Danube to deal with barbarians, but at this time, in 177, he made his son Commodus full co-emperor. Commodus had already been Caesar, or junior emperor, since 166. Now Commodus was nominally full and equal emperor, with Marcus Aurelius as Lucius Verus had been. Lucius Verus, by the way, died from the Antonine Plague in 166. So now in 177, Commodus is full co-emperor, and he is on campaign with his father against these barbarians. The campaign was going reasonably well, but Marcus Aurelius by this point was in poor health. It seems that he was just kind of exhausted from spending much of the second half of his reign in army camps, and he died in an army camp in AD 180. So Marcus Aurelius' death marks the end of the era commonly known as the reign of the five good emperors. And as we'll see, it also marked the end of the wars against the Marcomanni. I will give Marcus Aurelius an A-. Marcus Aurelius was a dutiful and diligent man who reigned well in a time of great turmoil. His wars were hard and trying, but ultimately he was victorious. I think a lot of people blame Marcus Aurelius for allowing himself to be succeeded by Commodus. He made Commodus a full emperor, so in some sense, the blame for the disaster of Commodus's reign, spoiler alert, falls on Marcus Aurelius. But I think what we have to consider is that Marcus Aurelius probably feared that if he did not make Commodus his successor, or indeed his co-emperor, then the result on his death may be another civil war that Rome could ill afford. So he probably felt he had no choice other than to make Commodus his successor. Verus had died from the Antonine Plague, so I think perhaps Marcus Aurelius was worried about, oh my God, what is going to happen if I get sick and I die as well? Who will take over for me? Maybe he wasn't aware of how big a turd his son was. Maybe it was just a matter of, or maybe Commodus wasn't such a turd when he was young. Some sources suggest that actually he was corrupted by his friends. But regardless, I don't blame Marcus Aurelius as much for Commodus as some others do. I think he kind of felt that he had no choice, and that the risks of Commodus becoming emperor were less than the risks of a civil war breaking out. Okay, so let's talk about Commodus. Oh, Commodus. Commodus was emperor from AD 180 to 192. Well, he was emperor before that, as I had mentioned, as a colleague of his father, but those are the dates of his sole reign. He was sole emperor for 12 years. So Commodus is kind of a strange figure at this point in Roman history. If you've been following along, or if you just know about Roman history, you will recognize that at this point, it is not actually common for biological sons to succeed their fathers as emperor. The only other time this had happened was when the Emperor Titus succeeded his father Vespasian. So Commodus is just the second biological son to succeed his father, and he is the first emperor who was born as the son of an emperor. He was a born prince. So yeah, he's an unusual figure in that way, and obviously the other good emperors prior to Marcus Aurelius had adopted their adopted sons succeeded them, not biological sons. They chose their heirs, and they chose them rather carefully. So to dispel myths caused by the movie Gladiator, Commodus did not kill Marcus Aurelius, or at least there was no evidence that he did. And there was no question that Marcus Aurelius intended for Commodus to become emperor, because he had already made Commodus emperor in 177. So when Marcus Aurelius died, Commodus did not become emperor. He was already emperor. He simply became the senior and sole emperor. The first thing Commodus did was make peace with the barbarians his father had been warring against. This is sometimes depicted as out of cowardice or laziness, but in Commodus's defense, the war had dragged on intermittently since 166, and there was a recognition at this point that what is the point of continuing? It is foolish to try and conquer territory beyond the Rhine-Danube frontier, or to really expand the bounds of the empire in any way. The empire had been severely weakened by the plague. Basically, it was time for peace, and Commodus decided to make peace. Can't really fault him for that. Because of the hollowing out of the empire as a result of the plague and the endless wars that his father had been engaged in with these barbarians north of the Danube, Commodus was in no position to rule as Marcus Aurelius had done. But it is also true that he had no interest in ruling as Marcus Aurelius did. Commodus represents a complete break with his father's stoicism, sense of duty, justice, and basic decency. Commodus by comparison, was capricious, arbitrary, and lazy. So it didn't take him long to execute several of the advisors his father had left to guide him. Like many children, Commodus had no intention of living his life the way that his father wanted him to live it. He probably had a rather austere upbringing. Marcus Aurelius was not fancy. He was kind of an ascetic. Probably Commodus was like, what? Why would I live this way? I'm the king of the world. It's time to party. Commodus is commonly described as a tyrant, but I don't think that's really the right word, because Commodus was not ambitious enough to be a tyrant. He was fundamentally lazy, and he turned over government to a series of favorites who were all corrupt and massively unpopular. By the way, favorites are a feature of bad rulers throughout history. By favorites, I mean people who are like the friends of the ruler, the people who get in close to the ruler, win them over personally, who start to monopolize access to the ruler, and who use this position typically for personal gain. Favorites tend to mar the reigns of leaders who are lazy, stupid, or easily influenced. And Commodus was all three. In Commodus's case, it was mainly that he was lazy and stupid and didn't want to spend his days, poring over scrolls, doing the boring administrative work of being emperor. He could just outsource that to other people. But this caused huge political problems for Commodus. Just as a sort of case study, the most infamous of Commodus's favorites was this guy called Cleander, who was a freedman, a former slave, who rose through the ranks of the court to command the Praetorian Guard, and by the height of his power was basically acting as Commodus's prime minister. Cleander sold all kinds of offices, including admission to the Senate. So one year, for example, there were 25 consuls, which is like a record in all of Roman history. And all of these people paid Cleander to be appointed consul. Supposedly, he split the money with Commodus, who was kind of in on it, but people hate this kind of corruption, and ultimately Commodus was forced by an angry mob to execute Cleander. But getting rid of Cleander didn't solve the problem, because Commodus was always reliant on guys like this to do his job for him. Ultimately, the problem of just letting favorites run everything for you is that they inevitably become corrupt, and they provoke jealousy from other prominent people who want to be included in power, but who are being excluded from power by the favorite. The favorite has power by having a monopoly of influence over the ruler, and so other people who feel like they should have a share in government end up getting frozen out, persecuted, or sometimes even in Roman politics, executed by the favorite. And so this provokes power struggles within the elite that ultimately destabilizes your reign. This is exactly the dynamic that led to the first serious challenge to Commodus's reign in AD 182. So this was a conspiracy led by his sister Lucilla, who was bitter about being politically sidelined and decided it was time to depose Commodus. Unfortunately for her and her fellow conspirators, the guy they chose to stab Commodus instead, after sort of like jumping up from behind a pillar or whatever, tried to make a little speech before stabbing Commodus, which gave his bodyguards time to subdue the assassins. So if we were ranking assassins, that's an F-. At any rate, Lucilla and her family were exiled and then quietly murdered, and Commodus's non-reign continued. So if Commodus wasn't being emperor, you may ask, what the hell was he doing? Well, you probably have a pretty good idea. He was becoming perhaps the greatest megalomaniac of all time. So it's obviously well known and famous that Commodus fought as a gladiator and charged a huge sum of money from his own treasury every time he performed. He performed quite frequently, but he never put himself in any real danger. It seems like if he was going to fight guys, it would be supposedly he fought his own wounded veterans from the legions and just sort of cut them down, like guys who couldn't really stand up or were sick or had physical disabilities. He would just murder large numbers of animals in the Colosseum. Supposedly he would stand up on a raised platform so that the animals couldn't actually get to him, and he would just sort of fire his bow and arrow and just shoot them dead in huge piles on the floor of the Colosseum. So being a gladiator certainly scratched an itch for Commodus. Gladiators were enormously popular in the Roman world. They were huge celebrities. They're often compared to greats like sporting stars or movie stars or rock stars. They were kind of all three. There's really sort of nothing to compare it to. Gladiator shows were the most popular entertainments. The gladiators were the most famous people in the city, and throughout the empire, local gladiators as well were celebrated and renowned, and often were able to make huge fortunes through their fighting. So this is sort of like someone who's the president, also wanting to be a movie star at the same time. that's something like what this is. But the other thing is that being a gladiator, although gladiators are very popular in Roman culture, it was also seen as highly degrading for people of good family to participate in gladiator fights, because gladiators were infames, a class of Romans who were like untouchables. That you're like, it included people who were sex workers, performers. These are people who may be celebrated and appreciated in their own way by society, but as individuals, their occupation makes them forever sort of soiled. So all gladiators were effectively slaves, even if they were free people who volunteered to fight. So an emperor fighting as a gladiator was seen as sort of what you might say today, degrading to the office. Commodus also promoted the image of himself as Hercules, and we can see this today in the countless statues he had made of himself wearing a lion skin and holding a great club, just like Hercules. Supposedly, he walked around in real life dressed as Hercules as well, and demanded to be called Hercules. Nuts. After a fire burned down a part of the city of Rome, Commodus had a sort of like ritual refounding of the city, where he said that he was also now Romulus. And he renamed the city of Rome after himself. He renamed all the months of the year after himself because he had 12 names. He renamed the Roman fleet after himself. You get the picture. Commodus also became increasingly arbitrary, paranoid, and cruel. He engaged in random acts of violence. Supposedly, as his reign dragged on, he often had people killed for minor infractions or indeed no infractions at all. There was a whole family he tried to wipe out, a senatorial family. Basically, there was no evidence that they conspired against him, and he was aware of that. He did not accuse them of conspiring against them, but he said that they were so wealthy and successful that he felt like they must be unhappy with him. So he tried to wipe out their entire family, despite the fact they did absolutely nothing. On another occasion, he supposedly had a bath attendant thrown into a furnace because his bath wasn't hot enough. That being said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that no one's out to get you. There were many plots against Commodus, but his enemies didn't finally get rid of him until AD 192. So the plot that finally did Commodus in was actually arranged by his longtime mistress, Marcia. So she found her name on a list of people who were to be executed. So she created a conspiracy with other people whose names were on the list to poison Commodus. But there was a little bit of a Rasputin thing going on with this poisoning. It didn't work. Supposedly, Commodus vomited the poison out. So out of desperation, the conspirators had a wrestler just strangle Commodus to death while he was in the bath, presumably in water that was the exact right temperature. The Senate immediately passed a damnatio memoriae on Commodus, and he was consigned to the dung pile of history, where he belonged. Commodus is a clear F-, not much else to say. Okay, so in 193, after Commodus died, there was kind of like a year of chaos, much like after the death of Nero. After Nero, we had the year of the 4 emperors. Now we have the year of the 5 emperors, because that's how many claimants to the throne there were in 193. But we're only going to be ranking 3 of these guys, because 2 of them, Pescennius Niger and Claudius Albinus, they never were really emperors. They were just usurpers who were kind of in revolt for a couple years. So let's move on to Pertinax, who was emperor from January to March of AD 193. So when Commodus was assassinated, Pertinax was the prefect of the city of Rome, effectively the governor of the city and all of the surrounding lands, which was a very powerful position by this point. He was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guards, and this was confirmed by the Senate. Pertinax had served in the army and as a provincial governor, and so he had become a senator, but interestingly, he was of very humble origins. As a matter of fact, his father was a freed slave. So it's kind of fascinating, actually, that someone whose father was a slave could rise to become emperor, however briefly. Although he was acclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guards, Pertinax was determined to rein them in. Pertinax recognized that the Praetorians had too much power, and he tried to discipline them and make them accountable, because, as we've seen several times, the Praetorians are making and unmaking emperors. They are demanding and receiving enormous bribes. They have a completely outsized influence in the politics of the Roman Empire. And under Commodus, the Praetorians had gone completely out of control. They were totally corrupt, used to getting whatever they wanted. They were not disciplined or required to work in any way. They were a cancer right at the heart of Roman politics, and Pertinax recognized this, even though it was the Praetorians who had brought him to power. So Pertinax initially refused to give a large donative to the Praetorians. Recall that donatives, I know I've explained this several times, but a donative is money that a new emperor pays out. However, the Praetorians threatened him, and he was forced to cave and promise to pay them money. In order to fund this, Pertinax sold off a whole bunch of Commodus's property and slaves in order to raise money. But supposedly, ultimately, he only gave the Praetorians half of the donative that he had promised them and half what they had expected. So as a result, several hundred Praetorian guards stormed his palace. The guards who were on duty just let them in. None of the officials tried to stop them. They just stormed the throne room, basically. Pertinax did have some warning about this and could have fled, and he probably would have found sympathy from the actual legions who, actually had to fight and resented the Praetorians who were, posted in Rome for the most part, where the emperor was, and received all kinds of perks, huge payouts, massive privileges, and had an extremely cushy posting that legionaries, on the Danube frontier, say, where they were constantly worried about barbarian raids. They had to fight. Their lives were in danger. They were living in army camps that were uncomfortable. It was hard for them to marry and have families, etc., etc. They could have only dreamed of having the cushy life that Praetorian guards had. So Pertinax probably could have fled and come back to Rome with an army and destroyed the Praetorian Guard. Instead, he decided to receive these Praetorian guards who had stormed his palace, and he attempted to reason with them. Apparently, he spoke with them for quite a while and almost convinced them that they should take a pay cut and that their lifestyle was unsustainable. But eventually, the guards got bored of listening to Pertinax talk, and they ran him through with a sword and killed him, ending his 87-day reign. It's not a real grade, but I'm giving Pertinax an F+. I mean, obviously a failure to launch here, but I do feel kind of bad for Pertinax. Pertinax did identify a real problem in Roman politics, namely that the Praetorian Guard were at the heart of government and were able to effectively, and in some cases literally, hold emperors hostage to get what they wanted. However, Pertinax lacked the patience and the political skill to recognize that this was a problem that needed to be solved very carefully and gradually. He tried to do it all at once, and he suffered the consequences of that. Basically, I would say Pertinax was a brave but foolhardy man. Okay, the next emperor was Didius Julianus, who ruled from March to June of AD 193. So after murdering Pertinax, the Praetorians retreated to their camp. Supposedly Pertinax's father-in-law was there, and he started trying to offer them gold and make them promises. He was trying to calm them and I guess maybe get them to make him emperor. This turned into a bidding war, and word reached this guy Didius Julianus that, hey, the emperorship is on sale. And so Didius came on down and joined the bidding, and he was ultimately the one who won the right to call himself emperor in an auction. I mean, that's how scummy and out of control the Praetorian Guard had become. Didius Julianus literally bought the crown at an auction, and the bid that he made was 25,000 sesterces to each Praetorian Guard. And there were about 9,000 Praetorian Guards at this time. So Didius Julianus bought his throne for 225 million sesterces, which is an enormous, stupefying amount of money. It is a little bit difficult to say exactly how much that would equate to in modern day cash, but it was about 10 years' pay for an average worker per guard. So basically, Didius Julianus paid something like $300,000 to $400,000 each to the 9,000 Praetorian Guards. And for that high price, he bought himself the right to be emperor for 66 days. So in the wake of this absolutely disgraceful auction, the Praetorians were able to intimidate the Senate into accepting Didius Julianus, but they could not intimidate the people of Rome into accepting him. When Didius appeared in public, he was jeered at. He was called a thief and a murderer by the mob. They pelted with stones and obstructed his path when he tried to go to the forum. Basically, it was clear that the entire city was in revolt against this, what they saw as a totally illegitimate, corrupt emperor. Word of this quickly spread, and so very quickly, 3 different governors all proclaimed themselves emperor and refused to acknowledge Didius Julianus. As we'd mentioned before, 2 of these were Pertinax Niger and Claudius Albinus. The third, and the other one who's really that important, is Septimius Severus. So Severus was the closest governor to Rome and was the biggest threat. Didius tried declaring him a public enemy. Then he sent emissaries to offer to share power with Septimius Severus. Severus either executed these ambassadors or won them over to his cause. So the only troops Didius had were the Praetorian Guards. And as we've mentioned, they had a pretty cushy posting. They didn't really go into combat. They were bodyguards. I mean, the only thing the Praetorians had ever invaded was a brothel. So Didius began trying to drill them in combat, but this did not go well. It's a little bit unclear what happened next. The Praetorians may have gone into battle against Severus's troops and been crushed, or they may have simply sort of melted away and refused to fight. Unclear. What is clear is that as Severus marched toward Rome, everyone abandoned Didius Julianus. The Senate quickly proclaimed Septimius Severus emperor and sentenced Didius to death. And Didius Julianus was killed in the palace by a centurion, and supposedly his last words were, "But what wrong have I done? Whom have I killed?" Obviously, Didius Julianus is an F- and arguably the worst Roman emperor. I mean, the only thing that would keep me from saying he is outright the worst is that he wasn't in power long enough to even screw anything up. But buying your crown obviously makes you extremely pathetic, and it's even more pathetic when it doesn't work. So one of the biggest losers of all time. Okay, so Didius Julianus was replaced by Septimius Severus, who was emperor from AD 193 to 211. Septimius Severus is a pretty interesting dude. He was the first Roman emperor who was born in Africa. His ethnicity is somewhat debated. He was descended from, on the one side, an Italian family that had intermarried with locals in North Africa. He's sometimes depicted as being more dark-skinned. He's sometimes been depicted as being black. I'm not sure that that's the case. He was sort of partially North African, though. Some sources describe him as being ethnically Libyan. Whatever that means. These kinds of ethnic designations are not totally clear in the Roman world. But regardless, Septimius was the first really provincial Roman emperor, someone who, did not have a background in Italy and was not really even of Italian descent. He was born into an equestrian family, but he was ultimately able to be admitted to the Senate, and he advanced his career through the army and through holding governorships, partly as a result of the Antonine Plague, because a lot of people died. There were openings. There was an opportunity for someone like Septimius Severus to advance up the sort of social political ladder in a way that may not have happened in other time periods. So he had been appointed governor of Pannonia by Commodus, which is sort of in modern-day Central Eastern Europe. And that's where he was in 193 when, after it became clear that Didius Julianus was a bad joke, he declared himself emperor. After being acclaimed by the Senate and ridding himself of Didius Julianus, Septimius restored the reputation of Pertinax and had his assassins executed. In a way, Septimius kind of made good Pertinax's project of reforming the Praetorian Guard. What Septimius did was he stripped those who were currently members of the Guard, that is, those who had killed Pertinax, and auctioned off the throne to Didius. He stripped them of their special super good boy armor that they had, and he exiled them from the city of Rome. They were forbidden. Anyone who had been in the Praetorian Guard who had been involved in the execution of Pertinax and the accession of Didius was forbidden to come within 100 miles of the city of Rome on pain of death. So he disbanded the Praetorian Guard as it existed. But then he replaced the old Praetorian Guard with troops who were loyal to him, and he actually increased the size of the Praetorian Guard to 15,000 men. But, he did 15,000 men who were loyal to him and who would be more disciplined. So between AD 193 and 197, Septimius defeated the pretenders Pertinax Niger and Claudius Albinus, who we had mentioned, and consolidated his power. And then he turned his attention to external threats. Septimius was a soldier emperor through and through, and he is best known for his reforms of the army. Septimius increased soldiers' pay. He made it easier for them to marry so that life in the legions was more attractive. And he also gave generous land grants to veterans. He provided them with donatives, although not enormous crazy ones, and not just for the Praetorian Guard, but for all soldiers. And he was also the first emperor to permanently station legions in Italy. Severus is really the first emperor who we can truly call a military dictator. I mean, he was someone who had, like Vespasian, he had come up through the army, but unlike Vespasian, he did not have to, reconcile himself to the Senate or anything like that. In fact, he executed many senators throughout his reign, anyone whom he distrusted. And as he had done with the Praetorian Guard, he replaced them with new men from the equestrian order and from the provinces. That is to say, men like himself who would owe their new positions to his beneficence. Like a latter-day Domitian, Septimius really saw no serious role for the Senate in government and instead fully emphasized his own authority as commander-in-chief, you might say. To this end, he continued the trends of expanding the bureaucracy, taking power away from the Senate and building a sort of professional civil service, and appointing lawyers to help him issue binding legal rulings that came from the center of power, i.e. himself, and standardized practice throughout the empire. Kind of a more militaristic Hadrian in this sense. But you'll see, and perhaps you noted as we talk about these reigns, there are sorts of continuing trends that are going on. And this bureaucratization and expansion of a civil service that is based more on equestrians and freedmen and people who are appointed because of their competence and not their birth, is moving away from the Senate towards a professional, semi-meritocratic civil service is one of the trends that is going on in Roman society throughout this sort of time period, and it goes hand in hand with the centralization of power. The emperor having a bureaucracy of people who can just do what he says, and people who will be loyal to him and who are in their positions because they know what the hell they're doing and not because of who their dad was. Septimius campaigned vigorously. He fought 2 campaigns against the Parthians and pushed the boundary of the Roman Empire all the way to the Tigris River. He annexed the kingdom of Azrini, which was one of the sort of border states, buffer states between Rome and Parthia, and take a drink because he again sacked Ctesiphon. Septimius's victory over Parthia is commemorated by the Arch of Severus, which again still stands in Rome today. So in 202, Septimius launched a campaign against a people called the Garamantes in Africa. So the Roman territory in Africa was sort of spread out apart from Egypt along the sort of northern strip of the Mediterranean. And the Garamantes were raiding Roman territory from further inland. Septimius Severus comprehensively defeated them and expanded slightly the Roman territories in Africa. And he also improved provincial border defenses up to stop further raids. He did the same thing along the border with Parthia, by the way. The Romans now, their policy was fully Hadrianized. They were really more interested in consolidating their borders, building watchtowers, forts, watch posts to prevent invasions, protecting what they had rather than trying to conquer more. That being said, Septimius did try to conquer. He tried to conquer Scotland. In 208, he went to Britain to invade Caledonia, i.e. the sort of like more northerly parts of Scotland, because the people living there had been raiding south of Hadrian's Wall, and it seems like the defenses had sort of weakened there. Although Septimius inflicted damage on the Caledonians, his troops were not able to get control of Scotland because they suffered horrible casualties as a result of guerrilla warfare tactics. And Septimius was not successful in his attempt to conquer Scotland. He tried to strengthen the border defenses elsewhere, as he had done in Africa and in Parthia. But while he was campaigning in Scotland, Septimius Severus fell ill and died in what is now the city of York in the north of England. His final words of advice to his sons and heirs, Caracalla and Geta, are legendary. He told them, quote, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." And that kind of sums up Septimius's reign. As we mentioned, he was a soldier emperor through and through. He is a transitional emperor. There's kind of been a process at work where the empire is becoming more and more militarized, but really this is sort of like formalized, I would say, by Septimius Severus's reign. And like I said, he is a military dictator. He is an army first guy. The orientation of Roman politics has moved away from the Senate. It's moved away even from the Praetorian Guard a little bit, and it has become the army more generally. The army has been strengthened, and Rome's defenses, its border defenses, have been strengthened by the reign of Septimius. However, politics from now on, as he said in his dying words, is really more dependent on soldiers. And emperors will have to watch out that their soldiers are not angry with them, because we are moving into a period where emperors are made and unmade by the army. I don't think that that's so much a result of Septimius Severus's choices as it is a reflection of how the reality of the empire has changed, that it is facing threats from both within and without, and it is the monopoly of arms that will determine who has power. I don't think that this Septimius Severus chose this. I think he was the first person to sort of acknowledge it and to fully orient his reign around this new paradigm. So I will give Septimius an A. I think he, again, this is a situation where I don't like military dictatorships, but he is a transformational figure. He was responding to the period in which he was living. His reign was successful and orderly, even if it's not, my cup of tea in terms of the sort of society I would like to live in. Septimius's success is undeniable, even though it will have the long-term consequences that most historians have seen in the last couple thousand years as being largely negative. I tend to think that emperors are more likely to be responding to the dynamics of the world that they live in rather than creating them. And I don't think Septimius Severus is to blame for the fact that Rome is to become a more militarized society. I think that's a long process playing out, and he's just sort of one of the first people to really fully accept that and act with that in mind. So following Septimius Severus's death, he was succeeded by his elder son Caracalla and his younger son Geta, who ruled as joint emperors for less than a year. So we'll quickly rank Geta first, since he was the one, spoiler alert, who lost the power struggle. So Geta was emperor jointly with his brother Caracalla from February to December AD 211. He was the younger son of Septimius Severus. The way that the sort of propaganda portrayed them as like a happy family who shared rule, Geta's role in this was supposedly that he was responsible for administration and bureaucracy and all this stuff, while his elder brother Caracalla was his father's right-hand man. And, it was a harmonious, power-sharing family. That's the way that the Severan propaganda portrayed them. But in reality, Geta and Caracalla clearly just hated each other. So they were with their father in Britain when he died. They traveled back to Rome, along with their mother, Julia Domna, who was a powerful and influential figure. But the two of them, apparently on their entire trip back to Italy, never spoke to each other, never stayed in the same place together, never dined together. They're totally separate, and they only communicated through their mother, Julia. When they got back to Rome, they split the palace in two, like a couple of kids fighting over, okay, we're going to take a piece of chalk and we're going to draw a line in the middle of the playroom, and that's your side and that's my side, and the toys on this side are mine and the toys on that side are yours, and don't come on my... This is basically what they were doing in the imperial palace. They may have had plans actually to split the empire into and divide it between them, but their mother vetoed that. So they were just sort of stuck in this limbo of having to share power while hating each other and not even talking. Caracalla tried to assassinate Geta during Saturnalia, which is like the Roman Christmas. This failed. So what Caracalla did was he had their mother, Julia, summon Geta to a peace conference where the two of them were supposedly going to reconcile. He had Geta agree, okay, I'm not going to bring any guards. I'm not going to bring any weapons. You don't bring any guards. You don't bring any weapons. Our mother will be the mediator and we'll talk it out. And so Geta came to this peace conference unarmed. And of course, Caracalla was lying. He had brought guards with him. He had them hiding. And then in the middle of the meeting, they burst out and they killed Geta, who died in his mother's arms. So I feel kind of bad giving Geta an F, but I have no choice. He clearly knew that his brother Caracalla was a monster. His brother had tried to kill him. This situation that they were in was clearly untenable, and frankly, Geta should have killed his brother before his brother killed him. So I feel bad kind of giving someone an F because basically they were the victim of a murder, but this is Roman politics, and it's kill or be killed, and Geta allowed himself to be killed by his brother Caracalla, who was a ruthless brute. So, F. Okay, so now we come to Caracalla, who is the last emperor we will be ranking today. Caracalla ruled from 80 to 11 to 217. So after brutally having Geta murdered, Caracalla forbade their mother to mourn him and set about completely destroying Geta's memory. He forced the Senate to pass a damnatio memoriae on Geta. He had his image erased everywhere he could find it, and indeed a lot of the images we have of the family have Geta's face sort of just wiped out as though he had never existed. Caracalla removed Geta's name from any paper records and made it punishable by death, even to say his brother's name aloud. Then Caracalla began a systematic purge of everyone and anyone remotely connected to Geta, anyone who had ever supported him or been accused of supporting him. You know, you are Geta's former barber's sister, so you go. And supposedly he massacred as many as 20,000 people in this extremely destructive purge of anyone connected to his late brother. So despite the fact you might imagine that Caracalla's relationship with his mother, Julia Domna, would have been damaged by, killing her son in her arms, he was actually pretty dependent on her and let her handle a lot of the dull administrative tasks. Caracalla was, like his father, a soldier emperor, but he was really solely interested in being a soldier. He was a great admirer of Alexander the Great and sought to emulate Alexander in every way possible. Caracalla was also a wandering emperor who moved around a lot, kind of like a shit Hadrian. In fact, in AD 213, less than a year after killing his brother, Caracalla left Rome, and I'm sure much to the relief of the people there, he never returned. He went on tour, and supposedly Caracalla spread terror everywhere he went as he traveled around the empire by making outrageous demands like ordering fresh seafood for dinner when he was hundreds of miles from the sea, and all the people would think, oh my God, what are we going to do? We got to find some fish for this guy or he's going to kill us. But the most infamous episode from Caracalla's tour was when he visited the city of Alexandria in Egypt. So the people of that city, or some of them, apparently thought it was a good idea to put on a play for Caracalla that featured a joke about him killing his brother. This may go down as the worst joke of all time because it provoked Caracalla into unleashing his troops on the city and carrying out a massacre and several days of pillage and burning. They put large parts of the city to the sword to show how much they did not enjoy this joke. So yes, Caracalla was a monster, but he also did do some real emperor things. In AD 213, Caracalla led a campaign against across the German frontier against the Alemanni, inflicting defeats on them and forcing them to sue for peace. Like his father, he also strengthened border defenses after he would conduct these sort of punitive counterattacks in order to help propel future raids, and it seems to have been largely successful, at least for several decades. He built the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, a huge bathing complex which could accommodate up to 1,600 people at a time. But Caracalla's most famous act was the so-called Antonine Constitution, or the Edict of Caracalla in AD 212. So this stunning document spontaneously made all free men in the Roman Empire full citizens and gave all free women the rights of Roman women. Prior to this, very few people outside of Italy were actually Roman citizens. The only other people who were, for the most part, were people whose ancestors had moved from Italy to colonize other parts of the empire. But citizenship was highly prized and quite rare up to this point. And Caracalla's proclamation that every free person is a citizen is sort of the end of a long battle in Roman politics about who actually deserves citizenship that goes all the way back to the social wars in the days of the Republic, which are centuries prior to the events we're discussing in these videos. So there's lots of debate about why exactly Caracalla did this, and whether it was an act of generosity, whether it was an attempt to continue the trend we've talked about standardizing and centralizing things, about making everyone a citizen, making law more standard across the empire. Making everyone a citizen also made more people available for him to tax. Certain kinds of taxes were only applied to citizens, so it may have been a way of raising money. It may have been a combination of all these things. That being said, Caracalla certainly needed to raise more taxes because he greatly increased the pay of the soldiers, even more drastically than his father had done. And he definitely followed, indeed exceeded his father's deathbed advice to take care of the soldiers and ignore everyone else. Caracalla also furthered another trend that we haven't discussed to this point, which is reducing the purity of the coinage. This had been going on for a while. We haven't really talked about it, but the inflation starts to really be noted in Caracalla's reign. So how this works is the Roman Empire, there's no bond market. So what happens is the government issues coins, silver and bronze. And so, if you've got to pay people in coin, you've either got the coin to pay them or you don't. You have to get it from somewhere. You have to tax people or like Trajan win a great war that gives you a bunch of silver and gold. Or if you have a lot of bills you can't pay, what you do is you just reduce the amount of gold and silver that you put in the coins. This had been going on for a while, seesawing back and forth of this emperor reducing the amount of precious metals and coins, this one moving it back up. But this causes problems in the long run because people can tell that the coins are garbage, basically, and it leads to inflation the same way that like cheap debt would in our world. Also because of Gresham's law, which is that bad money drives out good. So in other words, if I've got older coins that have, more gold or more silver in them, I'm not going to spend them. I'm going to spend the crappy new coins that Caracalla is releasing that don't have as much gold and silver in them. And I'm going to save the good ones that I have because they actually have more of the precious metal that supplies the value. Long story short, this is something that's been going on for a while that will become a more serious problem. This issue of inflation, this issue of coins not having actually that much gold or silver or not as much as they're supposed to have in them. Caracalla is not the first person to, debase the coinage. But it's noticeable in his reign and is likely a result of the fact that he has to pay more money to the soldiers. So in 216, Caracalla launched a campaign against Parthia after the Parthian king refused to let him marry his daughter. This campaign was not conclusive because Caracalla was wintering in Edessa, and one day he rode out to go visit some temple. He stopped at the side of the road to have a pee along the way, and while he was doing that, one of his Praetorian guards stabbed him. The exact reasons why this happened are actually pretty interesting, but that's a story that we're going to discuss in the next video when we consider the career and brief reign of Caracalla's successor, Macrinus. So I will give Caracalla a D+. Caracalla is a brute, clearly an awful person, a monster. But as I had mentioned in the first video, I'm not here to make windows into men's souls or to make moral judgments. Caracalla's reign was not super successful, but he did have some genuine accomplishments. It will continue to be debated whether or not his constitution that granted everyone citizenship was well-intentioned or not, but regardless, it was a significant step. It led to a greater standardization of the empire and the bureaucracy. He, was not an unsuccessful campaigner. He improved the empire's defenses, and he also massacred a whole bunch of people. But basically, I think the reason why he is a D-level emperor is mostly because he had an undesirable personality, and it led to him getting killed when he was quite young, and he only managed to reign for 6 years. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video, things are really going to start to get weird as we will start breaking into the crisis of the 3rd century when there were all kinds of emperors nobody's ever heard of. Some of them have pretty interesting stories. It's going to turn into a little bit of a lightning round where there, a lot of emperors who ruled for less than 2 years and ended up getting murdered. A lot of intrigue and interesting stuff going on there. So be sure to check that out. And if you like this video, please subscribe to History Snob. Give us a like. And definitely comment and let me know what you think. And yeah, stay tuned for the next video. Thanks for watching.